Hey all, welcome back to ancient Rome. You've almost survived the journey. In section one, remember that we covered the rise of Rome and the rise of Julius Caesar, as well as the fall of Julius Caesar. And in section two, we talked about the rise of the empire under a man named Caesar Augustus and the way he established the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And in section three, we covered the rise of Christianity and the importance of especially the Emperor Constantine in legalizing Christianity. And today we talked about some of the long and short-term causes of the fall of the West, or the Western Roman Empire, Rome itself, in the 5th century, the early 5th century. So hang on, fasten your seatbelt, and get ready to discuss in the final section. I know you're all so excited. Chapter 6, Section 5, the roots of Western civilization. And hopefully you know what Western civilization is, and if not, you probably will know a little bit more at the end of this video. So to borrow a quote from the textbook that you all know and love, and that you all read, I'm sure, the Romans borrowed and adapted cultural elements freely, but the Romans created a great civilization in their own right too, whose art and architecture, language and literature, engineering and law became its legacy to the world. So that's where we're going to pick up right now and talk about the legacy of Greco-Roman civilization, also known as classical civilization. So the Romans knew that they weren't original in everything, and that's okay. They acknowledged their debt to the Greeks. Educated Romans learned the Greek language, and all these things sort of mixed together. That is, the Greek, the Hellenistic, and the Roman cultures all mixed together to create what we call the Greco-Roman or classical civilization. And so this produced a new and very unique culture. And so one of the things that the Romans were masters at doing was taking the ideas of other people and adapting them to their own kind of will and preferences. And so they actually took Greek art and literature and adapted them to their own ideals of strength, permanence, and solidity, or being solid. And that is what we'll talk about next. It's one of the cool things that the Romans developed was they took Greek art and they took it in their own direction. So the Romans learned how to do sculpture or make sculptures from the Greeks. And we'll talk more about this in a moment. Another big thing that the Romans did and became famous for in their own right was something called bas relief. You can see it here. We'll talk about it in a minute, as well as painting mosaics and doing a lot of paintings. Especially, they were known for doing large murals called frescoes on the walls of big walls of buildings and outdoor places. So the reign of Augustus was a period of great artistic achievement. The Romans further developed their skill at bas relief, basically to tell stories, to represent crowds of people, soldiers in action, in battle, and landscapes. And they were also particularly skilled at creating mosaics, which is where they take all those little stones and make beautiful big pictures out of it, as well as painting murals. If any of you have been to Rome, you may have visited Pompeii, a little city just outside of Rome, that in 79 AD had a major volcano eruption. So Mount Vesuvius erupted in AD 79, and ironically, the ash preserved a lot of the ancient Roman art. So one of the classic things that was different between the Greeks and the Romans was that the Greeks were very much interested in showing ideals, beauty, moderation, everything in perfect proportion, and basically idealizing everything, trying to create the ideal man, the ideal woman, the ideal scene. And the Roman sculptures created a lot more realistic portraits. They just took a more practical view of pretty much everything. And a lot of Roman art was not created so much to idealize beauty as to educate their public. Okay, and so I mentioned mosaics. And by the way, if you want to see some really amazing mosaics, you need to come visit my church, St. George Greek Cathedral in downtown Greenville. You can't miss it on Academy Street. And there are some incredible mosaics up on the ceiling. But the mosaics were pictures or designs made by setting small pieces of stone or glass or tile onto a surface. And most Roman villas, or places where rich people lived, country houses of the wealthy, had at least one colorful mosaic in the house. A lot of these things, like I said, were found in a thick layer of ash that was discovered after Pompeii exploded and killed, or the volcano exploded and killed about 2,000 people. And the ash acted to preserve a lot of the buildings and works of art, which is kind of good for us, kind of bad for the people that didn't make it. Just here are some of the things up close, right? Here's I believe, a mosaic, which you can't see very well because it's not close enough, but you can Google it if you want to see a much better picture. And then there are a couple examples. A bas relief, there is, of course, Mount Vesuvius, not a place that you would want to be near when it erupts. And then here are some more paintings, some murals that were discovered after Mount Vesuvius. And then there's Pompeii. This is kind of depressing, but when you walk through the streets of Pompeii, or, well, in some places, I believe this was in a museum, although I was there a really long time ago, so I'm not sure. But they have these basically almost like the frame of a body preserved in the ash. All right, let's get back to literature. We actually already kind of talked about this, so I'm going to fly through this, but if you remember, I think it was in section 2, actually talked about how the Romans really thought the Greek epic was amazing, and so they took that idea and created their own epics, especially a guy named Virgil who wrote the Aeneid. But the big twist that the Romans took was, whereas the Greeks wanted to portray sort of the ideal hero practicing arete, or excellence in all things, the Romans were very nationalistic. They just wanted to praise Rome and glorify Augustus's empire. And I'm not going to bore you talking about Horace and Ovid again, because you can look back at your old notes, but I just wanted to mention them here. History, we also talked about this guy Livy, who was not a great historian, but he was good at praising Augustus and sort of creating this national myth, glorifying the Romans, glorifying their virtues, but didn't really have very good sources and didn't really practice critical thinking skills and was pretty biased. And so historians today don't really take his stuff very seriously. Tacitus, on the other hand, lived after the age of Augustus, and he was a much better historian. He wrote several works, including the histories and the annals and Germania, and he was much more of a critical thinker, more of the kind of historian that I want you all to be. He used good analysis and critical thinking skills. He spoke out against Nero, even though that was kind of a scary thing to do. And so historians look back and think of Tacitus as a pretty great guy, kind of like the Greeks viewed Thucydides. Herodotus was pretty good. He was better than anyone before, and he was the father of history. But remember, Thucydides did a much better job. And then I'm also not going to bore you again talking about Roman philosophy, because basically the Romans took a lot of things from the Greeks. For example, the philosophy of Stoicism, which was based on the Greek philosophy founded by a guy named Zeno, who basically said the universe is created by reason, duty, virtue, moderation, endurance, independence, self-sufficiency. They're all really important. And remember that Seneca, who was actually a Roman, denounced the gladiatorial games. He was a famous Stoic. And he was really concerned and spoke out against slavery, so really concerned about the plight of slaves, and he spoke out against slavery and how they were and how slaves were treated. And he served Nero, but Nero was a little nervous because he thought he was kind of a ticking time bomb. And so, knowing that Nero wasn't too happy with him and that Nero was completely loony, he committed suicide. And then Marcus Aurelius, one of the 5 good emperors, was a great Stoic philosopher and writer. He wrote a book called The Meditations, and he tried to govern the empire according to Stoic ideals, which wasn't that bad compared to a lot of emperors. Finally, in education, Latin was the language of the educated. It was the language of the church, and this led to the creation of the Romance languages, which most of you actually speak or are learning in school. Finally, the Romans were master builders. They built the arch, the dome, concrete, aqueducts, even though their pipes had lead in them. They built the great Colosseum. If you have been there, it's pretty phenomenal. And they built great roads. They also had a great influence on our founding fathers here in America. If you look at some of the architecture of Washington, D.C., very much influenced by ancient Greece and Rome. And finally, the Romans were extremely influential in terms of helping lay the foundations for a system of law in the West, in what we call Western civilization. So Stoicism was a really important part of that. This idea that everything should be governed by moderate, reasonable rule. And the Romans indeed were master rulers. They governed each province in the same way. They were very consistent with their rules, and they showed sort of a sense of universal fairness, and came up with that idea that you're innocent until proven guilty. And so we can credit the Romans for doing a lot of those things, and we'll learn more about those things in times to come. But for now, you have finished this chapter, and you can pat yourself on the back. And just in case you were interested in meeting Bella, she is a great girl, my Australian Shepherd. Well, actually one of them. Don't know if I can get the other one to come in the camera. Bella, say hi to the students, okay? There you go. Okay, very good.